Hi, the beginning of the story shows a group of gangsters torturing someone in a warehouse. Apparently, this person has a debt to the gangster leader, but he paid it off a long time ago. Here, they're not going to kill the person, but only scare him by torturing him with a baseball bat and swinging a baseball at the person. Z movie recaps are on. Subscribe and give us a like, and we'll keep going. A gangster boss ordered his assistant named Frank to retrieve a bounce baseball. But when Frank entered the warehouse, he saw the gangster boss finish off his hostage and leave. Meanwhile, Frank was ordered to remove the man's body. Soon the police arrived and arrested Frank on charges of killing the man. Apparently, the gangster boss had framed Frank, and now he was to be imprisoned. After 19 years, Frank looks older. Frank was sentenced to 19 years in prison after being slandered by the gangster leader. On this day, Frank will be released and looks very happy to be reunited with his family. Walking quite far from the prison, Frank met a young man who was supposed to be his biological son named Joy. Here, Joy apologizes for not being able to pick Frank up by car but can only walk. While Frank was in jail, Joy had to treat his mother, who was very sick. So Joy had no choice but to sell their house and car belonging to Frank. However, Joy's mother, or Frank's wife, could not be saved anyway, and in the end she had to die. After hearing all this, Frank could only apologize, and then they continued on their way. The next day, Frank asked Joy to take him to their old house. Joy refused because the house was sold, but Frank just wanted to pick up a few things and some money that he had buried in the backyard. Eventually, Joy took Frank to his old house in a cab. Once there, Frank went straight to the backyard and dug up the ground. Then Frank took some of the money that he had buried, as well as the baseball bat that the gangster leader used to finish off his hostage. It seems that Frank has a lot of money, and this amount is almost $2 million. Apparently, all of this Frank earned by robbing banks, while he must still be the right hand of the gangster boss. Then Frank went back to the cab and invited his son Joy to rent a luxurious apartment. Once there, Frank and Joy were very happy because now they could enjoy life again. Here, Joy asks Frank not to take revenge on the gangster leader who robbed him. However, Frank does not respond to Joy's words and instead invites him to a store to buy a luxury watch. Not only that, Frank also buys Joy a new cell phone and a sports car, so that he will no longer be humiliated and bullied by his friends. Later that night, Frank invites Joy to dinner at a fancy restaurant. Here, Frank happens to see a sexy lady sitting near his table. Joy realizes that his father has not been in touch for a long time. He also invited his father if he wanted to meet this woman. Finally, Frank dares to invite a woman named Mona to meet her. That night, they went straight to the hotel to make love together. After Frank was satisfied, he immediately took Mona home and promised to see her again the next day. After that, without saying anything to Joy, Frank secretly went to the house of his former partner in the gangster business to get the address of the current gangster boss. Obviously, even if Joy forbade it, Frank would still get revenge on the gangster boss who had once framed him. But when he got there, Frank's partner's house was already inhabited by gangsters. And it turned out that Frank's partner had died 5 years ago. Not giving up just yet, Frank went straight to another former gangster colleague of his named Cox. Upon seeing Frank, who had been released from prison, Cox apologized and said that in the past he had not interfered with the gangster leader who had slandered Frank. In fact, Cox immediately left the gangster when he found out that Frank had been framed. Frank didn't mind because he believed Cox was a good man. Frank only came here to ask where the gangster's leader was. Cox swears he knows nothing, and Cox only knows that he is still recruiting 2 of their former co-workers who helped Frank. Upon hearing this, Frank thanked him and then intended to go back to his apartment. But before that, Cox invited Frank to his daughter's wedding, which is in a week. The next day, Frank is seen panicking because his son Joy was not in the apartment. But after yelling loud enough, Joy finally came, and he just looked down. Joy asks his father not to overdo it because Joy is an adult. Frank replies that he loved Joy so much that he didn't want to lose him. After a long search, Frank finally found one of them, i.e., Jimmy. Here, Frank immediately pointed a gun at Jimmy and asked him where the gangster boss was now. Jimmy, who didn't want to open his mouth, immediately started to fight with Frank, which led to a fist fight. Unfortunately, after a long fight, Jimmy was able to escape. The next day, Frank is seen preparing a gun to hunt down Jimmy and another partner. However, this time he was caught by his son, so Joey immediately scolded Frank. Joey doesn't want Frank to retaliate because it won't solve the problem. However, Frank insisted, saying that they were the ones who made Joey suffer for 19 years and led to the death of his mother. Then Frank did leave, and this time went to Jimmy's colleague named Thrips, a meat seller. When Thrips saw Frank approaching, he immediately got scared and apologized, because in the past he had helped frame Frank. Then Frank asked where the gangster leader and Jimmy were. Thrips swore that he knew nothing about Jimmy's whereabouts. After Thrips gave this information, he hoped that Frank would forgive him. However, Frank shot him in the head anyway. Frank then went to Coke, his good friend, and told him that he had just killed Thrips. The next targets were Frank, Jimmy, and the gangster boss. After that, Frank repented. Shortly after that, Frank returned to his apartment, and there he suddenly got a bad headache. Frank immediately called the maid and asked her to call his son Joy. However, when the maid opened Frank's cell phone, there was no connection with Joy at all. Frank asked her to look at the call history because he had contacted Joy last night. But the maid still said that Frank's cell phone had no call history at all. Frank didn't want to get more headaches from thinking about it and immediately asked the assistant to leave because he was going to rest. A few hours later, Frank had a woman as a guest. This woman pretended to satisfy Frank even though she intended to steal all his money. Frank, who was not so stupid, immediately sent the woman away. But the woman did not accept the offer. At the same time, a man, a colleague of the woman, appeared and asked Frank to hand over all the money. But Frank, who is not an amateur, immediately pulled out a gun and quartered the man. Frank, who still had a conscience, did not kill the two men, but only drove them away. Frank then drove his car to find out Joy's whereabouts, but on the way, Joy contacted Frank and told him that he needed help. Joy also gave his current location, so Frank immediately went to the location. Upon arriving there, Frank immediately entered the warehouse and then found Joy, who was injured. Joy did not tell him what happened, so Frank quickly took him back to the apartment. Eventually, Frank took the initiative to take Joy on a pilgrimage to his late mother's grave so that Joy could pour out his feelings there. But when he arrived at the graves, Frank was shocked to see his wife's grave next to another grave with the name Joseph Carver, or Joy, his only son. Joy, who always accompanied Frank, was just Frank's shadow. Frank did not know that his son had died. Then Joy's shadow tells him that he was killed by Frank's colleague named Cox. Joy also asked his father to let him go so that Joy and his mother could rest in peace in the afterlife. Eventually, Frank promised that he would be sincere, and then their paths parted. Frank then took all the money he had left and went to see Maine, a woman he had dated in the past. Frank gave all his money to Maine and then apologized for never coming back. He then went to a nursing home to visit the gangster leader. Here, Frank pretended to be going to visit the gangster leader while carrying a gift. When he entered the room, he saw the gangster leader lying sick and helpless. Then Frank opened the gift, which was supposed to be a baseball bat, which the gangster leader used to kill his hostage. Frank also intended to finish off the bandit leader with the baseball bat, but did not do so immediately because Frank had a principle of not attacking people who were in danger, helpless. Eventually, Frank presented the baseball bat to the chest of the gangster leader and set out to track down Jimmy, who had replaced the gangster leader in his current position. He had just come out of a nursing home. Suddenly, Jimmy attacked Frank first, which led to a shootout. Frank is much more experienced than Jimmy. Frank finally managed to kill Jimmy by shooting him in the leg, who was hiding behind a car. After that, Frank rushed to the wedding of the daughter of Coke, Frank's partners. Obviously, Frank did not go there to attend the party, but to ask why Coke would kill Joy, Frank's son. Once there, Frank was immediately confronted by Coke and his daughter. Frank asked Cox to explain everything about the reason why he killed Joy. Having no other choice, Cox finally confessed and told everything. At that time, Joy was living in terrible conditions as Frank was locked up in prison. After the death of his mother, Joy became desperate and decided to become a drug addict. Joy asked Cox every day for money to buy drugs. So eventually, Cox got sick of it, and Cox had no other way to end Joy. Cox apologized again because it was all done out of necessity. After hearing all the explanations, Frank still seemed intent on killing Cox. But Frank immediately remembered his sin and immediately gave up his intentions. But when they went outside, Frank was surrounded by several police officers. Apparently, when Frank had drunk Cox earlier, Cox's men immediately contacted the police and reported that Frank was getting cranky again. The police, who knew that Frank was an ex-convict, quickly surrounded Frank. Here, the police warned Frank not to move if he did not want to be shot. However, Frank, who was fed up with life, kept walking so that the police showered Frank with bullets. As he was dying, Frank was seen smiling happily because his son Joy was beside him. Afterwards, Frank let out his last breath with a very happy feeling. What would you do if you were Frank? Write in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to get more recaps. Bye.